This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News. I'm Sophie Ikenye. Our top stories. The military council in charge of Sudan offers to start a dialogue with protesters, but they want a civilian government.
Why isn't there a transitional government? All those people who died, have they just gone in vain?
But the council says President al-Bashir will not be extradited to the International Criminal Court, where he's wanted on charges of genocide and war crimes. A Wall Street winner e-commerce site Jumia becomes the first Africa-based startup to list on the New York Stock Exchange. Also in the program, what's the outlook? The IMF's top boss tells us that Africa has all the potential for continued economic growth, but is the forecast bright across the continent? And in sports, it's a huge day for teams that have qualified for this year's Africa Cup of Nations, with the draw taking place today in Cairo. Thanks for joining us on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. Military leaders in Sudan have sought to reassure protesters that they have no ambition to rule the country long-term after they removed President Omar al-Bashir from office. Now, the military council says it is ready to move aside and allow for a transition to civilian rule with plans to hold elections. But demonstrators fear the coup leaders are too close to the former president and defied an overnight curfew by remaining on the streets to reiterate their demands. Paul Adams reports.
The revolution did not go to sleep. Throughout the night, tens of thousands of people thronged the streets of the capital, defying a military curfew. The atmosphere was festive. Yesterday saw the end of a 30-year dictatorship. But for all the song and dance, there's real anxiety too. The demonstrators are not willing simply to swap one military leader for another. Once again, ordinary soldiers mingled and participated, the apparent support of rank and file giving the crowds the feeling they're not alone. The new day brought no let-up on the streets. The demand here is for real, not cosmetic change.
We want what the Sudanese Professionals Association has said in their statement. We want a civilian transitional government as soon as possible. If it has to be the army who makes this happen, then we don't want anyone from their side who has been part of the regime in any way.
Why isn't there a transitional government? All those people who died, have they just gone in vain? We cannot accept this.
But it seems the military may be listening after all. It says it won't tolerate chaos, but it's offering dialogue and a more rapid transition.
We are the guarantors of their demands. We are the guarantors to help them achieve what they aspire, but it has to be with agreement and consensus from all political groupings. All of us, we should work hand in hand. We are not against the demands of the people. We are for the demands of the people, and we help them to achieve them.
But the military says it won't hand over the former President Omar al-Bashir. He's been accused of genocide and war crimes by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. This morning, the UN urged Sudan to comply.
Our position on this is very clear. We do encourage the authorities in Sudan to fully cooperate with the International Criminal Court.
Sudan's revolution remains delicately poised. The streets and the military not yet in agreement. This country of 40 million people still facing an uncertain future. Paul Adams, BBC News.
So just what is the way forward for Sudan? To discuss some more and possible solutions, I'm joined by Muredi Mutiga from the International Crisis Group. Thanks for taking time to talk to us on the program. We are already seeing fragmentations within the military. Does it mean the protests are finally making the council waver?
I think this is a moment of considerable peril. We know that Bashir designed the security forces deliberately to be fragmented, fractious. He has generals that have disparate loyalties, but all reported to him. The danger now is that the longer this stalemate persists, there is a real possibility of fragmentation among the security forces. And that's why it is essential for the generals that have taken power to hasten the transition, to make it more meaningful, to reach out to the civilians, and to announce a civilian-led transition that might be more acceptable and that might end at stalemate that might lead to chaos.
But there is still no clear leadership or anyone who's been fronted by the protesters. What's the best approach to this now?
Well, it's understandable why the protesters have so far not put forward their leaders. When in January, some spoke out on behalf of the Sudanese Professionals Association, they were arrested and detained and tortured. So we obviously understand why they didn't come forward, but now the transition seems to be picking up pace, even if it's very incomplete. It is time for the protesters to form an umbrella group that can then advocate for a proper civilian-led transition, a broad, inclusive government that would involve elements of the protesters, some within the ruling party, but also some within the securocrats establishment.
All right. Murray, the African Union yesterday reacted and they said that the military takeover is not the appropriate response to the challenges facing Sudan and the aspirations of its people. Now, aside from releasing statements like this, what concrete thing can a body like the African Union really do?
Well, the rules of the African Union are expressly clear that you cannot change governments through extra-constitutional means. In 2000, all its members signed up to these rules. And so what is expected is that the Peace and Security Council of the African Union should meet and suspend Sudan's membership until the security forces agree to a civilian-led transition for a defined time that then paves the way for free and fair elections. However, it's not lost on observers that the current holder of the rotating chair of the African Union is the Egyptian president, and he has come out to offer full-throated support for the events in Khartoum. So I expect that there will be push and pull within the African Union, and perhaps there could also be a stalemate there.
All right. So Murray Mutiga from the International Crisis Group, thank you for your thoughts. Thank you. Well, we heard in Paul Adams' report earlier from Ravina Shamdasani, the UN spokesperson for human rights. I spoke to her father about whether Omar al-Bashir is ever likely to face trial.
Unfortunately, accountability has not been forthcoming in Sudan for decades now. There is a pervasive impunity for past violations and for more recent violations. As I mentioned, just since December, there have been dozens of protesters who have been killed through the excessive use of force in Sudan against them. We don't have an exact number, but estimates range from 40 to 70 protesters who've been killed just in the past 3 or 4 months in Sudan. We're urging the authorities to take confidence-building measures early on during this transition period by bringing to account those who are responsible for past violations of human rights, and also, as I said, by bringing to the table dissenting voices to plan a transition that will lead to a sustainable peace and development for Sudan.
You seem to be calling a lot on the authorities to do something, but it doesn't appear like you're making any headway or you're making any traction at all. Do you even have UN investigators in the country to try and figure out what is really going on?
No, indeed. As I said, we've actually been engaging with the government of Sudan over the past few weeks, and they have engaged positively with us. In fact, they had invited us to conduct a technical mission to the country on Sunday. This was before yesterday's events. So there's a bit of uncertainty right now, with regards to whether our visit will end up taking place or not. But we will continue to engage. The UN Human Rights Office, really, we have, as the United Nations body dealing with human rights, we seek to advocate publicly for states to comply with their international human rights obligations. We speak on behalf of civil society to advocate for their voices to be heard. But at the same time, we also stretch our hands out to the governments to engage constructively with them to make a real difference in policy and in the way that they engage with civil society. And we will continue to do this with the authorities in Sudan.
Ravina Shamdasani there from the UN Human Rights Office. Let's take a quick look now at other stories making headlines across Africa and the rest of the world. The World Health Organization has expressed deep concern over the increase in Ebola cases in the Democratic Republic of Congo amid fears it could spread to neighboring countries. More than 750 people have died in the outbreak. But at a meeting taking place now in Geneva, the WHO says it does not constitute a public health emergency. Now, authorities in Ethiopia have foiled an Al-Shabaab terror plot. The Attorney General announced the suspects were planning to carry out attacks in busy districts and convention centers in the capital, Addis Ababa. They are now under arrest as the investigation continues. However, unlike neighboring countries, terror attacks are rare in Ethiopia. Protesters in Algeria have descended on the center of the capital, Algiers, to demand the departure of the new interim president, Abdelkader Ben Salah. Demonstrators who have gathered every Friday for the past 2 months say Mr. Ben Salah is part of the political establishment. He was appointed earlier this week after the resignation of Abdelaziz Bouteflika. Now, Africa's biggest e-commerce company, Jumia, has become the first startup from the continent to list on the New York Stock Exchange. Now, the company raised $196 million by selling shares at $14.50 each, and that values Jumia at over $1 billion. Now, Jumia is based in Nigeria, but has 4 million users across 14 different countries in Africa. And despite the company's sales jumping by almost 40% last year to $147.3 million, it has over $1 billion in debt. Now, investors, though, are betting on its potential for growth. At the moment, only 1% of retail sales are currently done online. Now, Larry Mado, BBC Africa's business editor, joins me from Nairobi. Larry, help us understand how this is good news for African startups.
Sophie, this is a major validation for startups on the continent hoping to make the mark globally, but also hoping to raise money beyond the continent. So far, with Jumia having listed a few hours ago, the stock is doing well. It's up 55%, and the share price is about $22.50 right now. So given that paper valuation for Jumia right now, more than $2.5 billion. So it's a good first step for other companies on the continent hoping to also make it to the New York Stock Exchange or other global bourses like the London Stock Exchange or others.
What are they banking on to build investor confidence?
So far, 14 African countries is a major feat for Jumia because no other e-commerce platform has done that, at least not at that scale. And they have a major first move advantage because Amazon or Alibaba do not quite operate on the continent. So that for them is a major point that they hope to capitalize on and expand. And this is especially important because today also the global logistics provider DHL has announced a competing product called DHL eShop. And they are allowing consumers in 11 African countries to buy from nearly 200 retailers based in the UK and in the US, and they will deliver to the home, because that's been one of the challenges for e-commerce sites, not just Jumia, but many of its competitors. In many parts of the continent, you don't have street addresses, you don't have quite the way to get to people's where they live, and that means there's a lot of cost. People don't trust selling and buying online, so they will not pay in advance. They want to use credit cards. They hope for you to pay when you deliver, and sometimes that means there's millions of shillings, millions of dollars, millions of naira in debt.
So are there any specifics that it is offering for African manufacturers?
So not quite a specific product for African manufacturers, but for a lot of African entrepreneurs who struggle to build a distribution network to reach customers, you list on Jumia or one of its competitors, and then they remove that hassle for you. You will have a page similar to what is your front shop, but it's all virtual, and then they will get you in touch with customers. The customer will pay Jumia, and they will deliver, and you get your cut. For a lot of small businesses, for entrepreneurs who are starting out, it's a major game changer. It's the difference between staying afloat or completely collapsing. But there are customers who don't quite trust what they see. There's lots of running jokes, and sometimes Jumia is the subject of trolls. People say what you see on Jumia and what gets delivered is not often the same, and that inconsistency is not good for their business.
All right, Larry Mado for us there in Nairobi. Thank you. This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News with me, Sophie Ikenye. Still to come, Peter with all the sports news as the Liverpool manager Jurgen Klopp calls for lifetime bans from football events for fans who hurl racist abuse at players. I'm Sophie Ikenye and you're watching Focus on Africa from BBC World News. The top stories on this program. The United Nations is urging Sudan's military leaders to hand over deposed President Omar al-Bashir to face justice at the International Criminal Court. Africa's biggest e-commerce company, Jumia, has become the first startup from the continent to list on the New York Stock Exchange. Now, a young, energetic workforce, new technologies, and the determination of some African leaders to deal with corruption. These are some of the positive signs the IMF's top boss, Christine Lagarde, says she sees in Africa's economy. Well, the BBC's Nancy Kachungira spoke to Ms. Lagarde about the outlook for the coming year.
Our forecast for 2019 for the global economy is 3.3. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, we are at 3.5. But that's very deceptive. We have roughly half growing at more than 5%, and the other half laboriously at 2-ish%. That's one distinction. The second one is that you have some very large players on the continent. And then the third layer, in my view, is population, because you have to really look at growth per capita. And you have countries that are growing very fast, and you have population giants.
For you, what are the bright spots?
The youth energy, because you always start with demographics, you always start with people, and you should always focus on people, actually. The second one that gives me hope is new technologies, and new technologies applied to financial services, for instance. Because when you look at a country like, say, Kenya, very well known, you know, the role of M-Pesa in expanding access to banking services, to financial transactions, and how it has enabled and empowered a lot of Kenyan women in particular. That gives me hope as well. The determination of some African leaders to actually deal with some of the issues that plague the entire economy around the world, which is corruption. Mm-hmm. And I'm encouraged by that, because I've seen several leaders, including in the last few days, say to me, yes, we welcome the diagnosis that you are proposing to conduct in our economies. And I think that's really important.
And you can watch the full interview on In Business Africa on BBC World News TV this evening at 18:30 GMT. You're watching BBC Focus on Africa. Let's find out what's happening in the world of sport. Peter.
Many thanks, Sophie. And the draw for the 2019 Africa Cup of Nations takes place in Cairo, Egypt, in just about 20 minutes' time. The country was only handed the task of organizing the tournament in January and faces a race against time to be ready for the June 21st kickoff. But it looks like all is now set, at least for the draw. The team seedings were released on Thursday and were decided based on the latest FIFA World Rankings. So the 4 highest placed African teams, Senegal, Tunisia, Nigeria and Morocco, are in pot 1, alongside hosts Egypt and defending champions Cameroon, and so on and so forth. The BBC's Matthew Kenyon sent this report from Cairo.
Well, pretty much everyone who's anyone in African football is making their way to the pyramids on the outskirts of Cairo this evening for the draw for the 2019 Africa Cup of Nations. It's going to be a spectacular setting and maybe a spectacular ceremony as well. We're promised African footballing greats like Rigobert Song, Yaya Toure, Joseph Antoine Bell will all be involved. For the very first time at this tournament, there will be 24 names in the draw hat. Nearly half the continent's footballing teams have qualified for this newly expanded Africa Cup of Nations, giving first-time opportunities to nations like Burundi, Madagascar and Mauritania. The top seeds, the host nation Egypt, alongside them in the top-seeded pool, teams like Cameroon, Nigeria and Morocco. It looks a very, very strong lineup for this tournament. The draw gets going at 18 GMT. And remember that Egypt have only got a couple of months now to get things ready for the kickoff of the tournament. It goes from June the 21st.
Matthew Kenyon there. Now, the second leg matches for the CAF Champions League quarterfinals take place this Saturday at Lubumbashi in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Five-time winners TP Mazembe host Simba of Tanzania with the aggregate score at 0-0. Al Ahly, who've won the competition a record 7 times, face an uphill task when they host South Africa's Mamelodi Sundowns in Cairo. Sundowns won the first leg 5-0. Holders Esperance of Tunisia take a 3-2 lead into their home game against CS Constantine of Algeria. And Wydad Casablanca host Guinea's Horoya AC with the score level at 0-0. Finally, Chelsea have been praised for their swift response to racist chanting aimed at Liverpool striker Mohamed Salah. The Blues prevented 3 people from entering the stadium for Thursday's Europa League quarter-final game at Slavia Prague after a video appeared to show them singing an abusive song about Salah. Chelsea are working to identify the other 3 who did not turn up. Salah's manager at Liverpool has called for live bans for racist football fans.
We should not see it as a Chelsea thing or a Liverpool thing. So it's another sign for something is going wrong a little bit in a moment outside there. But it's still only a few people are doing it. But the stronger the reaction is from all the rest, from all of us, the more it probably will help to avoid things like this in the future. That's why I said that these guys now. It's not always, and it happens in other parts of life as well, but these guys now are football fans, so if you do something like that, you should not be allowed to enter a stadium again, from my point of view, in your life.
So, Finn, that's your sports. Off now to go and watch that draw and see who Nigeria get, and of course, who Kenya get as well.
Of course, indeed. Thank you for the sport, Peter. Thank you. Now, the global contemporary art market is booming, generating $1.9 billion in 2018. Art from Africa accounts for only 0.2% of total auction sales. But this is changing. Congolese art collector Sindika Dokolo owns more than 5,000 pieces of African art. Raisa Okoye went to meet him.
Why doesn't contemporary art appeal to the masses in Africa? Whereas when it comes to music and fashion, it resonates with so many. Investing in art is almost a daily job for the Congolese art collector Sindika Dokolo. He owns one of the largest art collections in Africa, with more than 5,000 pieces worth 50 million euros.
My parents were collectors themselves. I started collecting very young, especially classic art and ceremonial weapons. They were offering me a piece every year. Then I caught the collection bug. Since then, it had been a quest at the very roots of my sensitivity, of my own identity. That's the journey that my collection reflects.
According to the Congolese art dealer Didier Claes, only 3 to 4% of Africans sit among the big buyers of classic art in Africa. If you too want to invest in art, here are some tips from an experienced art collector.
The 3 main tips to collect art: passion, then you have to be curious, try to understand the artist, his background, his context, and third, you have to be rigorous. Generally, a collection starts with a piece of art, and this often starts with a favorite.
In April, Sotheby's auction house sold a collection of contemporary African art for $3 million. This shows that demand and interest in African art is on the rise.
Before we go, a quick look at the top story on this program today. Military leaders in Sudan have sought to reassure protesters that they have no ambition to rule the country long-term after they removed President Omar al-Bashir from office. That's all from the program. From me and the rest of the Focus on Africa team, thanks for your company.